Hey, Walter Sorrells back with another Knife Makers Friday 5. Today we're going to talk about Bainite. Is it the most important thing ever to happen to swords or not? My friend and longtime customer Mark Kramer recently asked me to talk about Bainite. Now, I'm a little trepidatious about talking about Bainite because in order to talk about anything to do with metallurgy, you really have to kind of back up and talk a little bit about some basics of metallurgy. It's real easy to get very deep in the weeds and kind of, I don't know, get carried away into details that a lot of people probably aren't interested in. But at the risk of boring the snot out of you, I'm going to jump into this topic anyway. Forgive me, it's probably going to get very detailed. Some of you guys won't be interested in that. If you just want to kind of get my conclusions about Bainite and its use in swords, just jump right up here, and we'll get to that part. First, though, I'm going to go ahead and launch into the metallurgy. So the first question is, what is Bainite? Well, before we get to that, I'm going to start by talking about some real basic metallurgy, because if I don't, then basically I'll just end up sort of talking little analogies and mythologies, and we won't really get to the heart of what makes Bainite interesting and why it might be useful in swords. All right, let's go. So if you take a random piece of steel, and steel is always composed of iron and carbon, sometimes other things, but you have to have iron and carbon or it's not really steel. If you take a random piece of steel and you cool it down, it's going to form into little grains, analogous to grains of sugar, grains of sand, something like that. Each one of these grains has its own little crystalline structure, and that structure is homogeneous throughout the entire crystal. And so those kinds of grains come in three basic categories. You have ferrite, which is pure iron, 0% carbon. You have a second kind of grain structure, which is known as pearlite. That contains roughly 0.8% carbon, and that percentage doesn't ever vary. And then there's another form called cementite, which I think has about 6.6 or 6.8, I forget, percent carbon, so much, much higher percentage of carbon. Why is that interesting to knife makers? Well, when you heat steel up, the crystalline structure changes, and you up around 1425 Fahrenheit, which is give or take 800 centigrade, the steel changes to a different structure. And at that point, it becomes something known as austenite. Now, if you take austenite and you cool it, it will transform back to pearlite, ferrite, cementite, whatever distribution it was before it got heated up. That's sort of all things being equal. That is, if you cool it down slowly. But if you cool austenite quickly and you have enough carbon in there, it will transform to something different. A steel that is in the sort of general range that would be considered knife making steel, which is somewhere around 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, 1% carbon, maybe even a little higher than that. And you heat it up to the point where it transforms to austenite and then cool it really rapidly, it'll actually transform to something called martensite. Now, martensite is much harder than pearlite. And so this is what, when we hear about quenching, we hear about heat treating, these kinds of terms, what we're talking about is this process of heating up to transform the steel structure to austenite, and then cooling it down rapidly enough that it'll convert to martensite. So this is what's known as a triple T chart, or a time temperature transformation chart. Basically what you have is an axis here, which represents time, and note that this is logarithmic. So The increment from here to here is 1 second, from here to here is 10 seconds, from here to here 100. So up here you're talking about days. This doesn't represent a particular steel. It's just kind of a theoretical model. But you know, it kind of gives you a general sense of how steels operate. So you've also got temperature here. This is temperature in Celsius. This is temperature in Kelvin. Unfortunately for those of us in the US, it doesn't have the temperature in Fahrenheit, but we'll adjust and overcome. So anyway, what this indicates here is once you heat steel up to this austenite phase that we talked about and then cool it down, what's going to happen to it? There are a whole bunch of different kinds of transformations that can happen here, and this tries to give you a sense of if you cool it down at any particular rate, what exactly is going to happen. So let's say we cooled it down along this line right here. In other words, we cooled from up here around 700 Celsius down here to around 0 Celsius in 10 seconds. What's going to happen? For this particular model right here, as long as it misses this little portion right here, it's going to come down to here, and this line right here, MS, is what's known as Martensite start. So as it cools down, it's going to pass this point right here, the Martensite start line, which is roughly 225 Celsius here, it looks like. That's a little over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that point, it's going to begin to change into Martensite that we talked about earlier. As it goes down and down and down, 50%, and down here, it's going to be completely converted to Martensite. And so now, right down here, in this range, just around 100 Celsius, which is about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be completely converted to something that's useful for a knife. In other words, Martensite. What happens if you go on this curve right here, you take, 10 seconds to get from here to here? Well, you see it's pearlite here. What's going to happen is, as you come down through here, it's all going to convert to pearlite. Of course, we've also got ferrite and cementite that's in the equation, but assuming that this is around 0.8% carbon, then we're going to have all perlite, and it's just going to go right through here. It's going to change to perlite, and when it gets down to here, it's not going to matter that you pass Martensite start, because it's already starting to convert to perlite, and you're going to get something that sucks as a knife. All right, there's our magic word, Bainite. What if we want to produce Bainite? And we'll talk about why you'd want to produce Bainite later, but what if you did? Well, first thing is, if you hit that nose right there, you're going to start to produce perlite, which you don't necessarily want. And if you go past Martensite start and you avoid that little nose there, then you're going to get Martensite. But if you can sneak it down to this point right here, just above Martensite start, which is in the, again, depending on the steel, 450, 500 degree Fahrenheit, or around 250 degrees Celsius, and then you just hold it long enough at that temperature, what'll happen is it'll convert to this stuff, Bainite, which is the magic stuff that we want to talk about today. Now, notice right here, we're out here at 10,000 seconds because of the logarithmic effect here. So what this means is that for a lot of steels, you just can't get to Bainite in any convenient amount of time. You have to quench it down here at this fairly high temperature, 250 Celsius, and then hold it and hold it and hold it for hours, maybe even days, to convert it into Bainite. And that's just not a commercially convenient amount of time, and it has other negative consequences for the steel that just make it like it's not going to make sense. So There are only certain kinds of steels, and Howard Clark's famous for his L6 steel Bainite blades. And there's certain, that's one of the kinds of steel where this nose is far enough over here, and this part of the curve is close enough here that you can drop it down to this level right here before you hit martensite start, and then hold it maybe for a couple of hours, and it'll convert to Bainite. All right, so we've been really deep in the weeds on the metallurgy here. Let me kind of circle back a little bit to the real world and talk about what Bainite is from a sort of practical perspective and why somebody might even want to have this in a sword at all. All right, the traditional approach to making a Japanese sword was to coat the spine with clay, and that clay would act as a heat sink, so that as you heated it up to an austenitic temperature and then brought it back down by quenching it in water, the edge would convert to martensite, but this clay would retain enough heat that the spine would not convert to martensite and would therefore turn back to perlite. Perlite is shock resistant, but it'll bend pretty easily and take a set. So what the, at least potentially a drawback of Japanese swords is you can have this really hard edge that holds a nice, holds a good edge, but if you whack a really hard target, they can bend and take a set, and you have to, wrestle with them a little bit in order to straighten them back out. So let's talk about the qualities of Bainite. Bainite has two qualities that are useful to sword makers in a way that they might not be useful to folks making pocket knives. What's different about a sword from a pocket knife? Well, the difference is that it's very long, there's a lot of weight and inertia in it, and when you chop something, there's a lot of force, a lot of shock that's applied to that blade, and if it's too brittle, it'll break. The Japanese got around that by the process that I was just talking about, by making what we modern metallurgists would call a differentially hardened blade. So it's soft, pearlitic on the spine, and hard martensitic on the edge. So the disadvantage of that is it will bend. So what Howard Clark did was to figure out a process that would allow him to dip into temperatures low enough to create martensite, and then pop back up to a temperature that he could hold for several hours, or whatever it takes. I don't know exactly what his process is, but you could hold for a substantial amount of time above martensite start, and the spine would convert to Bainite. By doing that, he gets a blade that sort of has the general appearance of a traditionally made Japanese blade, which has a hamon that shows the demarcation between the hardened and the softer part of the blade. By holding it up there above martensite start, he was able to produce this bainitic spine. I don't know exactly how he does it, but I've reproduced that on blades myself. If you can read a time temperature transformation chart, you can figure out a process that will allow you to do that. So let me just kind of generally hit the whole issue of Bainite. There's nothing magic about Bainite. What happens a lot of times in the sword world is that something that has some kind of narrow little benefit, all of a sudden people take that narrow little benefit to become, something magic. And they think that if we just sprinkle this magic fairy dust over, anything, that all of a sudden we'll have some unbreakable, invincible blade that, is like something off a TV show. In the real world, magic fairy dust can't just be sprinkled over things. You can't just say, oh, let's make this out of Bainite and it's going to be, this invincible sword. There are disadvantages to Bainite. It's not something that you want to use to make an entire blade out of. If you make something out of Bainite, it's like making it out of a truck spring. It's springy, which is great. It's tough. That's great too. You can whack it with a hammer, or you can, chop into all kinds of things, and it won't bend. It won't break. But it's not very hard. It doesn't hold, it wouldn't hold an edge for very long. And that's why the Howard Clark approach is cool is because you have still a hard edge and this springy spine. That's all great, but in order to produce Bainite, there are some trade-offs, and I won't get too deep into how this might work, but basically you have to keep the blade as you're producing it above martensite start for a substantial period of time. You have to dip below real quick to get martensite on the edge and then get back up to above martensite start and hold it there. Typically that's going to be in molten salt. In theory you could do it in molten lead, you could do it in all kinds of oil. I've actually done it in oil, but anyway, the bottom line is you have to hold it up there a good bit above martensite start. You don't want to just, if martensite start, let's say, is 425 degrees Fahrenheit, you don't want to hold it at 426, because if you screw up in any way, you're going to start producing martensite, which was not what you were after. So you have to hold it up a little bit higher than that. You may need to straighten the blade. If that's the case, you're going to have to take it out and monkey with it and still keep it above 425 degrees or whatever martensite start is for your particular steel. Get it back into the molten salt. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong, and so keeping it right there close to martensite start is fraught with difficulty. So you're going to want to keep it a good bit higher than that. If you do that, then you're also tempering that martensite, reducing the hardness of the martensitic edge. Now, you always are going to temper martensite to some degree, but the hotter you get, the more it goes from being something appropriate for knives to something that's appropriate for truck springs. So where am I going with all this? A guy like Howard Clark has spent years and years, perfecting his approach. He knows how to do it. He's got the equipment. He can do it and come out with a good result. With something that's imported from some tiny little town in China, I would personally be a little nervous about what process are they actually taking. Do they really understand how this works, and are they really doing it in an effective way? And as a result, am I getting something that is actually going to have an edge that has decent edge holding qualities, or am I actually going to get Bainite in the spine at all? A lot of moving parts here, a lot of things that can go wrong, and as a result, I would personally be skeptical about getting a Bainitic blade from somebody who really didn't have pretty strict controls on the process, and who didn't have, or that I didn't know for sure had a really clear understanding of what it was he was trying to accomplish. Not saying imported blades couldn't have all that. It's just something that, buyer beware, I guess. So wrapping it up, Bainite, is there anything magic about it? Is it something that you would want to make every blade out of? No, absolutely not. It sort of has this one particular narrow, interesting little use. In my personal experience, we used to make test blades back when I was really heavily into Japanese sword martial arts. We did a lot of test cutting, and we tested a lot of the blades that I made using sort of conventional Japanese heat treating techniques, where you're producing a pearlitic spine and a martensitic edge. If you cut really large, heavy, thick, nasty targets, which we did, sometimes you'd bend a blade. But if you use good technique and you're using reasonable targets, then you shouldn't bend a blade hardly ever. It's really when you push to the very edges of the envelope that you're going to run into problems. So for me personally, I never saw a particular need myself as a martial artist to have a Bainitic spine blade. It wasn't interesting to me. For me, I was, willing to take the possibility of the blade bending a little bit, because I knew that I was going to have a much harder edge than a Bainitic spine blade typically is going to have, both because of the types of steels that you can choose to produce Bainite with, and that's only a very narrow range of steels, and because of the fact that I was able to temper it at a lower temperature than I would have, at least, the way that I was able to accomplish Bainitic spine blades. we used to bend things, and this was blades that I had made. Really, we were just trying to test them to failure. We'd bend them, throw them on the ground, stomp them until they were straight again, and then start cutting again. Never one single time had a blade fail because of this. So for me, the resilience of the blade is really not an issue. If it's a properly made Japanese blade, bending it, straightening it, that's really just kind of built into the cookie, and it's part of what historically would have been part of the maintenance of a sword that was used in martial arts or battle for that matter. You just had to recognize that was part of it. You may have to bend the thing straight every now and then. Okay, so I've gone on endlessly here. This was way, way longer than I ever meant it for it to be. But anyway, just kind of wrapping things up. First thing is, Bainite, not magic fairy dust. It's really just a very, very narrow range of situations where you might find it useful. Basically, differentially hardened blades. If you're concerned about your blades bending, hey, try a Bainite spine blade. Second point, if you're buying an imported blade, I would just be a little, make sure that you find out about the reputation of the people who are making them, because it's no walk in the park to produce a Bainite spine blade that actually has a good edge that's going to cut and hold that edge for a long time. Thanks for hanging in there. A lot of detail here. If you're the kind of guy who likes nerding out on this stuff, then I think Bainite's a pretty interesting subject and worthy of spending some time on. See you guys soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make Hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make Hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.